think we're still missing a couple of people. As I mentioned, Mr. Stevens is going to be running behind. I guess the only other person will be Dr. Knox. Is that correct?
I think so.
I don't think Dr. Knox has a cell phone, but I don't have his.
He was on the other call, so he probably is just on his way or something, unless something came up. I don't know.
Dr. Thomas, are we live?
We are. We are.
Okay.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry. Yes, we're live.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started at 5:35. We'll call the meeting to order at 5:35 p.m. Dr. Thomas, if you would take roll for us.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Davis,
Here.
Mr. Stevens, Miss Davis,
Here,
Dr. Yeager,
Here.
Dr. Dykeman,
Here.
Mr. Worthy,
Here.
Dr. Gant,
Here.
Knox, Dr. Maddox. Here.
Thank you very much. We do have a quorum present. We'll keep moving with our agenda. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll go to item number 2 on our agenda, which is to amend or adopt the agenda. So I'll open the floor for motions.
I move that we adopt the agenda as written.
Second.
Okay, Mr. Davis made a motion to adopt the agenda as written before us, and Dr. Yeager seconded. Any questions or discussion? Okay, Dr. Thomas, if you would take roll for all in favor of adopting the agenda as printed before us.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Stevens, Miss Davis,
yes,
Dr. Yeager,
Yes.
Dr. Dykeman,
Yes.
Mr. Worthy,
Yes.
Dr. Gant,
Yes.
Dr. Knox,
Yes.
Dr. Maddox.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So that motion carries. So our agenda is printed before us. We'll move forward to item number 3, which is personnel recommendations. Dr. Thomas.
Yes, it is my request that you all approve the personnel recommendation that has been submitted to you. I did share that individual's information on our Friday board update. Our reason for asking to add this to today is based on the timing, and we just had a board meeting. It will be about 4 weeks, and then allowing the individual to submit a 2 to 3 week notice. This pushes us in a time when school supports, social emotional supports, nursing, of course, we just have some critical need for supervision, and those directors have done an amazing job of holding it with the support of some of our other staff, supporting them. But we would like to be able to get someone in that position of supporting our psychologists, nurses, and our school social workers, as well as leading our district equity work. So that was the reason for requesting. We have some other personnel that can wait until our next meeting, but we wanted to be able to move forward with leadership in that department.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. So we have the recommendation before us. I'll open the floor for a motion.
I move that we approve the recommendation from Dr. Thomas,
Second.
the personnel hire.
Okay, Ms. Davis made a motion to approve. Dr. Yeager was the second. Any questions? Okay. Dr. Thomas, if you would take roll for us for all in favor of accepting the personnel recommendation.
Sorry. Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Mr. Stevens, Miss Davis,
Yes,
Dr. Yeager, Dr. Yeager.
Sorry, yes.
I did the same thing. Dr.
Yes.
Mr. Worthy,
Yes.
Dr. Gant,
Yes.
Yes.
Dr. Maddox. Dr. Maddox.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. We appreciate your flexibility.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. We will move forward with the next item on our agenda, which is our policy training for the evening. I do thank everyone for joining us. I see that we have all of our board members except one who will be running a little behind, and Ms. Angela Palm, and I also see Dr. King as well, who is in attendance. So thank you for attending, as well as our board members elect. And so just a very brief overview, a part of the Cognia report and our efforts for continuous improvement is to be a bit more intentional about our professional development. And the report had implications for policy and professional development. And so this was definitely an area that we wanted to add to our list of trainings. And so Ms. Palm has agreed to provide training for us. And so I'm gonna turn the floor over to you, Ms. Palm.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. Since the last time I worked with this board, there have been a lot of changes. It must be really interesting doing all the work that you've had to do over the last year and a half, 2 years, with so many of you just starting out, learning how to be a school board member. It usually takes on into the second term to really kind of get the hang of it and get past the learning curve of that. So my hat's off to you, especially right now. This is probably one of the hardest times to be a school board member that we have had with the COVID-19 and trying to figure out what to do and how to keep everybody safe and get the kids learning. So we're going to talk about policy. We'll touch on the items from the Cognia report, but mostly what was in the Cognia report comes up a lot with school boards and how they function. So we're going to walk through that and talk about generally how to develop policy and things to look at. Move this over. Well, okay, we'll leave it alone. Okay. I was trying to move it over to help you there, but anyway. The role of board policy, probably from the first time that you had a meeting or you had any kind of training, certainly when you went to new board member training, one of the things that you heard right away was the board is the policy maker. And one of the interesting things about serving on the school board and actually city council, county commission too, you act as an entity, but you're a group of individuals who come together. So the board really is a group of individuals. You operate as one through your policy actions. The policies are there to provide stability and continuity. Whenever they're followed, they will provide that. And you also use policy to set the expectations and the requirements for everybody, including yourselves, the superintendent, the staff, and the board. And sometimes I found that school boards forget that the policies also apply to them. You have a whole section, Section D, about school board operations. And so sometimes that kind of gets lost. Another way to look at the role of the board is imagine you're in the helicopter. It'll be kind of crowded with all of you in there, flying high. And the reason you want to do that is it's important for the board to keep a view of the whole. And when you're high and you look out the windows of a plane or a helicopter, you can see a wide area. And you can see the differences in the areas as you look at it. But if you start coming down towards the earth, the closer you get, the smaller area you will see. And so if you stay high up, then it'll help you stay focused in your own role and keep you in your place of looking at the district as a whole. You may occasionally need to come down to take a closer look at something. But when you come on down, you tend to start getting into the weeds. And that's when the questions start coming up about whose lane are you in, and are you micromanaging, or are you stepping out of where you should be? So just as a visual, just keep in mind just to stay up high. As elected officials of the governing body, the public has certain expectations of you, as do the community, your staff, the students. I'm not going to read the whole slide to you. But basically that you would be operating in accordance with your policies, that you would treat each other with respect, that you would act in an ethical manner, that you would also act as professionals, that there's going to be transparency in your decision-making, that you would involve your stakeholders. You want to bring the community along with you as you move your school district forward, that there would be strategic thinking and planning along the line. So that's in the best of all possible worlds. Everybody would be following these, and we would see these behaviors in everybody. So it's a vision or goal to look at. And again, kind of a checklist to help you look at it and go, where are we on this? Where am I on this? And policies are more than the manual. I know you have a policy committee, and typically boards think of their policies as those things that you adopt and they go into your manual. They can be helpful to you in other ways, and other things are policies besides those things. First of all, as you do policies, and we'll talk about this more later when we're talking about creating policies, but you can use policy to create flexibility, to give some maneuvering room, or you can stifle innovation. You can use policies and put in a lot of rules and a lot of very direct, specific directions. And that's typically not something you want to do, because you want to leave some room for whoever is implementing that policy to be able to respond to new things that come up. So, but other things are, whenever you decide your budget, I think you probably I think I saw that you had adopted your budget. Whenever you did that, you had to make budget choices. So you had to set some priorities and act on those. That's a policy choice. Your hiring choices. Do you look outside? Do you try to grow your own? Those are policy choices. We probably hear a lot more complaints around hiring choices and personnel than we do most anything else. Because whether I'm at the legislature or just out talking to other people, nepotism always comes up, and there's always this belief, whether it's valid or not, it is the perception that school districts tend to hire relatives as board members, relatives of the senior staff of the district, and that's who gets promoted. And so I can't imagine you haven't heard that, but if you haven't heard that, congratulations, because I hear it all over the state. When you set your board agendas, the things that you spend your time talking about, those are policy choices and represent what you believe is important. And then of course is the choice of the rules that you do put in your manual. Now, a number of entities enter into this conversation about what you do, what you should do, how you should perform. And first, number one, we'll go with the State Board of Education and the standards for local boards. I know Dr. King has done a number of workshops with you, so you've heard about the standards before. And we always say which standard we're working on. Tonight is Domain 4, Policy Development. And the standard that the state board said for effective governance of school systems is that you would adopt, revise, and follow written policies that are clear, they're up to date, and they're in compliance with the system strategic plan, the state constitution, the state, federal laws, and the state board rules. The evidence that they look for, or the elements, whichever way you want to describe that, is that the leadership team, and the state board uses leadership team the same way GSBA does as the board and the superintendent. So the leadership team promotes policy that's aligned with the system strategic plan and supports student achievement. It specifically mentions the strategic plan, but actually there are other plans that you have to keep in mind. Your flexibility contract, your charter system, and within that flexibility contract, there were goals set out and descriptions of the things that you would do as a charter system. So as you make decisions, you also have to keep that in mind. In addition, there's a district improvement plan that's required by ESSA, federal law. And there was a template that the Department of Education made so that to make it easier for districts to fill out the district improvement plan and to post it. But there again, you have another plan, and there's no reason to do the work of having a plan just sitting aside alone. Instead, they should be integrated together, and so that everything is working together, and that when you make decisions about how you want to move forward, that you keep in mind the goals all throughout here. Do you know what your strategic goals are for the district?
You mean the strategic plan?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, good. Can you tell me one?
Improve student achievement, equity. There's 6 of them specifically.
Okay.
Those
Okay,
are the
you
10.
don't have to name them all. It's just, I was curious, because there again, as a board acts together and makes decisions, it's, as I just said, it's important to keep all those priorities in mind and what your goals are. And as you act together and act on those, the public who is watching your work sees that. And so they too understand what your priorities are, because they're probably not going to go look at your strategic plan. But whenever they see you focusing on the same goals over and over, they understand that that's what you want to achieve. And that also helps give them confidence in the work that you're doing and confidence that you have a plan and in how you want to move forward. If anybody has a question, any questions along here, just let me know. And another part of the evidence and the state board standards is that you will follow effective procedures for policy development, adoptions, revisions, emergency adoption, that you have a local policy that does that. You have at least 2 policies that cover this area, and that you solicit and receive recommendations from the superintendent on proposed policies. And of course, that there's opportunity for the public to review proposed policies. It's an interesting thing. Every district I know of lays the proposals on the table for 30 days before you actually adopt it. There is no legal requirement other than the reference in these standards that you do that. There is a legal requirement for the state board to do that and for state agencies to do it, but the local boards are not legally required to do it, but it's clearly something that the state board expects local boards to do if they are governing effectively. Also, that there will be systematic review of your policies to keep everything up to speed, and that you hold the superintendent accountable for consistent implementation of the policies that you adopt. This is going to come up again in a minute, but I'll go ahead and say it now. As I said earlier, one of the first things that you hear as a school board member is that you're the policymaker. And the other half of that you hear is the superintendent is the one to implement the policy. So you do the policy, the superintendent does the procedures for implementation. There is a third part to that, that is the board holding the superintendent accountable and for monitoring what is going on to see where you are in the process, and just to see that what you plan to happen is in fact what is happening. Another part of the evidence is that you would have adopted the Code of Ethics, which is your policy BH, and the Conflict of Interest, which is BHA. So that's the standards from the state board that apply to you when it comes to policy. There are also two accrediting agencies. I know you use Cognia. I don't think you do the Georgia Accrediting Commission. It's within the state rather than a multi-state as Cognia is. But they both have policies or standards related to policy. For the Georgia Accrediting Association, it requires the governing board to delegate to the superintendent all executive and administrative functions. Also that you publish your policies. They're very general and much more, they're not as strict as Cognia. And then we have Cognia. The two standards that they have relating to the governing board are two of the ones that were cited in the report. And one of them is the governing authority establishes and ensures adherence to policies designed to support system. And the second one is that the governing authority adheres to a code of ethics and functions within the defined roles and responsibilities. So those are the two that come out of Cognia. And most of the time when I look at does somebody have a question? Okay. Most of the time when I look at a Cognia report, boards are cited one way or the other on one or both of these as being completely, for anywhere from being completely insufficient to improving on it. So those are two areas that always come up. State law also gets into it. Excuse me. State law, and you may have already had this on one of your other sessions, but just to kind of keep everything together here, 20-2-49 lists the duties of board members. This was legislation that passed in 2010. A lot of it was already understood, but they decided to codify it. So they listed the skills they thought board members should have. And also in state law, they put in the motivation that they thought a person should have to serve on a local board of education. And it should be the improvement of schools and academic achievement of all students. And here we also get a reference to the code of conduct. They called it code of conduct at this point. Later, it becomes the code of ethics. And the conflict of interest, both of which were to be modeled on the roles and responsibilities of the local board members. And it actually deals with both individual and board behavior, in spite of the fact that we already said earlier that you act as one entity. Another code section of the state tries to separate the roles, and we talked about this a few minutes ago, that the board's role is policy, and also the duty of the local board to hold the local school superintendent accountable, that you do not have the authority to act independently. You're only authorized to take action as members of a whole. Policy BH is the code of ethics, and just to give you the statutory background of it and why you have it and why it's written the way it is. When the 2010 law passed, it required the state board to adopt a model code of ethics for local board members. And also, the statute says that the model code of ethics is supposed to include appropriate consequences for violation, which the state board chose not to do. They simply added a section that said that if the board felt that one member had violated it, if a majority of the members felt that there had been a violation, that you could hold a hearing. But other than holding a hearing, the state board has not delineated any kind of violations. Within 3 months of the state board adopting the code of ethics, the local board had to adopt that code of ethics at a minimum, and then incorporate any revisions that were made later. There's only been one revision to the code of ethics since the state board adopted the model in 2010. The state board rule also added one other thing that was not in the state law, and that is that you would have to adopt your code of ethics and any revisions to it at a regularly scheduled meeting. So if you were having a called meeting and you need to do this, you can do it and be within the state board rule. The conflict of interest is your policy BHA. That was the other policy that was required by the statute in 2010. It's also mentioned by Cognia and the State Board of Standards. There were a number of provisions already in law regarding a conflict of interest. All the conflict of interest things are around financial interest. And so they really just pulled all the other code sections and put them together. And that's how we got the conflict of interest that you have. And when the Code of Ethics was first done and sent to the local boards to adopt or revise if they chose to do so, the Voting Rights Act was still in effect in its totality. And the Code of Ethics had to be sent to the Department of Justice to be approved because it affected elected officials and who people can vote for. So that's when you look around the state, almost everybody has the same exact Code of Ethics. And that's why if you adopted the state model, then they were all bundled together and sent to the Department of Justice. And if the local board made changes to it, then they had to submit it on their own. So pretty much everybody just adopted what the state board did, and they sent it in for submission to the Department of Justice. And the Code of Ethics is one of the policies that comes up in the Cognia reports. And it comes up a lot, actually. I'm sure Dr. King gets the same kinds of phone calls I do. And when somebody gets mad at you, they don't like what you're doing, they start looking for something to hold against you or some way to prove that you're not doing right. And these also come up, as I said, in the Cognia report. So I'm not going to go through the whole Code of Ethics tonight. If there's sections I haven't pulled out that you want to talk about, I'll certainly do that. But I've pulled out the parts that tend to cause the most trouble for boards, not just with Cognia, but within their own behavior and getting along with each other, and also from the community. The very opening there is the opening to your Code of Ethics, policy BH. The Clark County Board of Education desires to operate in the most ethical and conscientious manner possible. And to that end, the board adopts this Code of Ethics, and each member of the board agrees that he or she will. And then, of course, there's a whole list of things. I highlighted the two things in red because this is where the first problem comes in. This is a Code of Ethics for the board. The board itself has agreed to follow this, and it also requires each member of the board to agree to follow it. So this is both for the board acting as a whole and also for each person serving on the board. Sometimes when people read it, they forget it is a policy that binds your actions and that your opening says you have all agreed to do this. It's not aspirational statements. It'd be really good if we could do this. This is what we are going to do and what we're bound to do. So, domain one is the governance structure. Very first thing, to recognize the authority of the board rests only with the board as a whole and not individual board members. And people read that and go, yeah, I got that. You already said that 3 times at least. And act accordingly. That's where those last 3 words are the stinker. And that's where people go, oh, because they can get with knowing the first part of it, but actually carrying it out in their actions and having their actions reflect that belief is sometimes a stumbling block. Support the delegation of authority for the day-to-day administration, excuse me, of the school system to the superintendent. There again, people go, okay, yeah, I've heard that before, all right, and act accordingly. So the actions have to reflect the understanding and the belief that this is what you are going to do. Honor the chain of command and take any problems or complaints consistent with the chain of command. I can't read it. Oops, wrong thing. I was trying to move that over. Anyway, honoring the chain of command is one of the issues that comes up, particularly when there is a lack of trust, or everybody is just getting to know each other. And everybody kind of gets used to doing things in a certain way. And people forget about honoring that chain of command. Another one, and that, remember, we're saying I will, and not undermine the authority of the superintendent or intrude into the responsibilities that properly belong to the superintendent or administration, including functions such as hiring, transferring, or dismissing employees. And that is an area, as I mentioned earlier, with personnel that often gets board members into trouble because they're trying to be helpful, or they're trying to do whatever it is they're trying to do. Sometimes it's with the best of intentions, and they don't really mean to be violating the code of ethics. And sometimes it's just to interfere with things. So, did any of those seem unclear to you? Or as I went through them, did you mentally add a but to the end of them as you heard it? It's like, yeah, that's good, but, and thinking, okay, when this happened, I really needed to do whatever. If anything's not clear, please let me know. And if you did have a mental but, then you need to think about that and think about why is that and how you can follow this and stay true to what it is that you believe in and that you're there to do. And just asking yourself, how well do you follow this section? How well do your fellow board members follow it? Is that an area that you need to work on together to follow that more closely? That first section is one of the ones that causes people the most trouble. And we're skipping domain 2. Domain 3 is board and community relations. No.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, there's a few questions.
That's okay.
Yeah, we have some questions.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't see hands or anything. Yes, but I love questions.
So John, I think you had your hand up first. Did you want to go first?
Yeah. So you're asking about the buts. What I find is that the code of ethics sometimes is hard to interpret vis-a-vis other parts of our policies. For example, if we are supposed to be trusted advisors, I forget exactly what the words, key advisors, I think is wording, that board members are supposed to be key advisors to a superintendent. And I can dig that up from our policies. But that sometimes may mean that that's not always happy news. And so is it undermining a superintendent's authority if you're bringing unhappy news?
No, unhappy news would not be undermining their authority if you brought something forward or in the discussion there was unhappy news. Discuss it within the board meeting and let it go. Now, where it would be undermining the superintendent's authority is if you had something that you disagreed with or didn't like or whatever your unhappy news is, and you discuss it in the board meeting and you don't like the consensus of the board. And so you leave the meeting and you continue your tirade about your unhappy news and what you don't like. Later in the code of ethics, which we'll get to that part, but it's about the board meeting. And once you come to agreement, then supporting the board's decision. So asking questions and having disagreements are not in themselves undermining anybody or negative behavior. It depends on how you do it.
Okay, just one follow-up because I know other people have questions, but you mentioned this only in the context of doing it publicly in a board meeting. If you have concerns that you feel that if you brought them up publicly that would be undermining and embarrassing, Is it appropriate or inappropriate to meet privately with the superintendent?
A board member can meet with the superintendent. The problem with that becomes that you stepped out away from the rest of them. And one board member is getting information that the rest of them are not getting. And that can become problematic. If you have a concern and you let your board chair know that you have some questions, and how would she like for you to handle that? Just to talk to the superintendent, or let the superintendent know that you have these questions and concerns, and decide along with the board chair how to move forward.
Okay. So I guess one other, sorry, follow-up question is, then should superintendents not meet one-on-one with board members? Because we were in a rhythm, or we were supposed to be in a rhythm of having done that with a previous superintendent. So do you think that's not a good idea?
I'm not going to go so far as to say it's not a good idea and do not do it ever. Sam, feel free to weigh in here as a former superintendent. I just think that it's one thing to have an occasional question and to need to meet with the superintendent to talk something through. And also the public tends to look warily at an elected board, not just a school board, but whether a city council or county commission, whenever you're meeting in one or a small group with the superintendent, because you're avoiding the quorum and the public meeting notices.
I really
so-
asked that for our superintendent, because
Okay.
that was coming from our superintendent to us, not the other way around.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
so it's not
And
always
it's
that,
just,
you know,
part of it's the public perception, that part of it also is that if a board member has a concern or they're just going to the superintendent to talk to them and the rest of the board is not getting that information, then that can end up causing problems.
Okay.
Where you may just start out just trying not to have problems. And so you're trying to open communication. When you have a new superintendent or you're getting to know each other, that can be a valid reason just to sit down and have a discussion.
And Angela, I'll
Yeah.
chime in here too. And that's absolutely right. And I know you all have been immersed in conversations about your norms and protocols. And that does have implications for how your governance team decides you want to function, especially within the communication, from the communication standpoint, how you communicate with your superintendent, how your superintendent communicates back with you. And much of it is what you have transparently agreed upon as a team. The other piece that we always try to remind boards about in reference to this is that it's much of it is also the intent of and the purpose of your communication in your one-on-one with staying within your roles in that communication. And I paused a little bit when I heard I think you said the advisor of the superintendent. That language, I think you said, was in your policy. The same thing comes into play with that. When you are considering yourself as a board member in the advising role to the superintendent, it has to be within the realm of that governance lens also. And the more you have those conversations and agree upon your practices, the better off you are with that. But I agree with what Angela said, yes.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, does somebody else have questions?
For Mr. Davis and Dr. Yeager.
Okay.
Trying to see if I saw any other hands.
Okay,
Go
Greg?
ahead, Trish.
Actually, that conversation just answered most of my questions, so I withdraw. Go ahead, Greg.
Yes, Angela. My question centers on the introduction of policy review. And I did not write down exactly the way that was phrased in the presentation, but it was something like, if I remember right, it was something that in consultation with the superintendent, policies would be brought forward for consideration. And I don't know exactly How
Yeah,
you,
yeah, the policies would be developed with the superintendent's recommendation.
so well, that was a little bit stronger than what I saw written there, but at least from my memory. But does that mean that all policy proposals would be done by the superintendent? Is that?
No, it's with, and I believe that's in the state board standards when we were going through what they considered evidence of following their standard around policy. And as I said, I know you have a policy committee so that you could have recommendations from the committee itself, but your superintendent should certainly be involved, or whoever she would choose to designate. She might have a different person that she wanted to have involved with various policies, so that the administration knows what direction you're heading. They may be able to give you some advice or information and provide resources to you as the committee does its work. So that's how that was worded in there. And I, like you, I don't remember the exact wording of it, but it is just to make sure that the superintendent is involved and that the administration would also be recommending the policy to the board, so that nobody's doing anything to somebody. You're doing it together. But since you're talking about the policies, I also wanted to mention, Mr. Knox mentioned one of your own policies that talks about trusted advisors. One of the important parts of the work of your policy committee is to make sure you don't have conflicting policies. And the code of ethics is derived from the model code of ethics. That's the same one the state board adopted. And so that one is where you would hold steady, and anything that was in conflict with that code of ethics, you would need to look at changing. And so I just wanted to not forget that. Any other questions?
Yes. Yes, I have a question. Angela, is it true that there are some boards across this country and also across this state are moving away from board members writing policies, and that is a responsibility of the administration? That's including the superintendent and staff members. And the reason for that, because of the fact that they are more equipped in terms of writing policies and knowing what to put in policies than board members. Over the years, I have traveled to NSBA all across this country, and I know that that was mentioned several times. Do you have any knowledge on that?
Yes, I can tell you that we have a few boards in Georgia who operate with committees, but most of them do not. And so the policy work is done by the administrative staff, and then comes to the board. The superintendent brings the recommended policy to the board. Probably lets the board know whenever it's being worked on. Particularly if it's something that is specific to the district and it's not something that's in response to legislation that just passed, which you know passed, and it's coming to you. Nationally, I believe it works the same way, but school boards are so different across the country. In some states, a school board is a board of really one school, or a very small population. So in that case, they really perform differently. But I would say certainly in Georgia that most boards have moved away from having committees that do the policy work.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Ms. Palm, I have a question, I guess, related to what you just said and Mr. Worthy's question. When you think about it, based on your experience of high-performing boards, are those typically boards that have policy committees?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part of your question.
Like boards that tend to be high-performing boards,
Okay.
do they tend to have policy committees or?
There's really no correlation between how well the
Okay.
board performs and whether or not they have committees.
Okay.
Does it matter if they're charter systems or some other model?
No, there are boards that have committees that are strategic waiver systems. So it really doesn't connect to that part of it either. I think it truly just comes out of the history of your district and how you historically did things. You've probably had committees for some time in Clark County.
Right. And so I'm just trying to, if there's a trend of people moving away from it, what's driving that trend? And so I'm always constantly learning more about our role versus the local school governance teams in our charter system. And so I don't know if there's an efficiency to be gained so that those 21 groups can have more input, or, you know, how do we manage through that, I guess would be one of my questions, if we didn't have a policy committee.
My guess is that as time went on and as things got more and more complicated in education, for instance, after IDEA passed in the 70s, and there were certainly a lot of rules around special education needs that had to be taken care of. There were a lot of laws that passed requiring districts to do all kinds of things. And it may have just been that school board members decided in some districts that they had no expertise to add to it. And that it was the educators and administrators in the district that were best at that, and just turned it over to them. It may have also been part of the switch over from appointed boards to elected and having the superintendent appointed, and shifting that governance structure. So there could be a number of reasons why it's happened over time.
So I think what I like about our policy committee is it's administration and the board. And so the department heads actually are participants in the policies. If it hits your department, then you definitely get the review on that and get to weigh in on those policies. So I like that part of making sure that we're not, they actually bring most of our policies to us in terms of what needs to happen. So.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with having a policy committee if that's the structure you want to have.
Right.
So I'm not critical of that at all.
Can I have, again, a follow-up question, because I think we're all kind of following on the same direction, Angela. So some boards don't have committees, and it's not because they're just a one wagon county. We're talking boards that have a good number of schools that they are administering, and they just don't have committees.
Right.
It has nothing to do with size.
Correct.
I'm just astounded. I mean, I do know a school board near us that meets for 1 hour and they have no committees. So they meet 2 hours a month, and I don't know how they do due diligence, you know, in 2 hours. I mean, I'm not questioning their ability. Don't get me wrong. I'm just astounded. It's like, because we certainly function. I mean, I certainly, you know, we don't want to cross that line of we're not managers. We're not running the school district. On the other hand, we've seemed to attract board members who have a lot of questions and they give a lot of thought and they do their homework. And again, I'm not saying this board that only meets for 1 hour a month isn't doing homework. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying it's a different mindset, and I don't. So what you said really surprised me, and I'm just trying to assimilate the knowledge.
Okay. Any other questions?
Angela, I'm sorry, go ahead. I have a follow-up question when you finish.
Oh, go right ahead.
Okay, my follow-up question is this, and this came to mind, and I jotted it down because, well, let me ask the question first. Is something being circulated or discussed in the state legislature that to increase the requirements for board members? Let me tell you what, I do a lot of reading with this, and I know that you do a tremendous amount of work with the state legislature. And I do remember several years ago, the State Chamber of Commerce was pushing to increase the requirements, change the requirements for members serving on the Board of Education. And they even went to the extent, and I'm quite sure you're familiar with this, they were even talking about testing board members.
Mhm.
Am I correct on that?
You are correct on that. The State Chamber and Advance Ed, which is what Cognitive was at the time, and the Metro Atlanta Chamber joined together to create the Commission on School Board Excellence to create recommendations for ways to improve school boards. And one of them was they wanted to increase the requirements for eligibility to serve on a board. They particularly were interested in adding an education requirement. As you know, there isn't one now. And this has come up since. As a matter of fact, Senator John Wilkinson, who up in North Georgia, just is finishing his last Senate term, did not run for re-election, tried to get something going with this, and he couldn't because there is no education requirement for the governor of Georgia.
Clearly.
And so, and also with the last time we talked about it, I said, do you know what percentage of the population of the state and of Georgia is college educated? And it's about 28%. But they're not all spread out and all across state. And so you would leave it where we would have places where it'd be very difficult to find people to run. And so that got shot down with Senator Wilkinson. But you're correct that there was a push, and I'm sure it will continue to pop up every now and then with people who believe that there should be additional requirements to be eligible to serve on a board, particularly that there should be some education level, whether it's high school level or GED or whatever. I don't think they'll ever be able to get it pushed through for college level. And yes, you also remember correctly that commission wanted to require board members to pass tests after they had their training to show that they were proficient and had actually learned. That also got shot down. Partly because the Voting Rights Act was still intact, and all of that would have had to go to the Department of Justice. And based on past experience, they knew some of the things they wanted would never get through there. For instance, one thing that they had to drop was they wanted all board members to have to run from the whole at-large instead of by individual districts, and that would never have been approved by the Department of Justice. So, but yes, you have a good memory.
Well, one other point, and I was shocked with this, and it turned out that it was true that you had some boards across this state, South Georgia, North Georgia, where some board members were illiterate, not able to read and write. And I was shocked. Are you aware of that? I just don't see how that can happen.
I have heard that in reference to one or two boards. I have no idea if it's true or not. I would say that board members are elected by the community. And if that's who the community chose, nobody ran against that person, then that's who they have. And actually a person who, if they were in fact illiterate and had worked and achieved to the point that the community would elect them to a local board, they probably have a lot to share about the need for education and how important it is. So
yeah, I know for a fact that it was true in one county. I won't call the name of the county because
yes, please don't.
I talked with the superintendent, and the superintendent explained some things to me. But anyway, some of that is going on.
Any other questions before we move on? All right. Domain 3, board and community relations. This time we're talking about how you operate within your community, and that you seek regular and systemic communications between the board, student, staff, and community. And that and remember, this one starts out, each member will. So each of you is responsible for this and responsible for communicating to the board and the superintendent what you're hearing from the public in relation to regarding your board policies and school programs. Do you see anything in there that it seems odd, having looked at what we did with domain 1? And I'll go back to domain 1 if needed.
The inclusion of staff.
And the inclusion of staff, and as you listen to the community and take these expressions back to the board, remember that you still have to honor the chain of command, and that you take information back to your board and to the superintendent. And so one of the places where school board members sometimes get themselves into a little bit of trouble is that when you're talking to people and they're complaining about something, you want to help them. They're your constituents. And so you want to provide service to them. And so you hear them, and you may just accidentally say, oh yeah, I can help you with that, or I can do this, or I can do that. And you're not supposed to do that. So you have to do this part in connection with domain 1 and all the things that it says about following the chain of command and who does what and how you do things. And so this doesn't give you carte blanche just to go out and start talking to people and getting into the nitty gritty of things that are going on into a school building.
But Angela,
But it also means, as elected officials, that you are supposed to listen to the community. Greg?
yeah, I wanted to point out something here too, and this gets back to what John Knox was questioning about meeting with superintendents individually or whatever. I feel like if individual board members hear something from the community, whether at a neighborhood meeting, whether it's church members contacting them or whatever, and certainly honoring the chain of command, but what that says is that we communicate that.
Correct.
Okay? Now,
Communicate it to your board and the superintendent.
well, here's the thing. I can't see going to a board meeting and putting on the agenda and say, Dr. Gant, I have a group of church members and they're just really upset at what's happening, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, that's not official board business. So that would be the type of situation where I would call up the board president. I would call up the superintendent, and I will say, these are concerns that I've heard. These are concerns that I've heard, and pass that information forward as specified here. I wouldn't see it being formally. Now, obviously, talking to whoever you're talking to at the time and expressing to them the chain of command is certainly what we should be doing. But when there's grumbling in the neighborhood, so to speak, about a particular school, I would see it totally within my responsibility to certainly let the superintendent know, whether it's regardless. I mean, I'm not trying to say what's true and what's not true. I'm just saying that this is what's being kicked about. And I wouldn't necessarily, I suppose I could by email send it to the entire board, but then you have a public record of that if somebody wants it. So tease that out for me a little bit.
It would depend on what it is. If the grumbling is about a particular person, a principal, a teacher, or a coach, that's one thing, and you certainly wouldn't want to discuss an individual in an open meeting. if what you're hearing are complaints about the math standards, then that's something that you could bring to the board and just say, I was at this meeting and they were complaining about the math standards. But if it's something that, as I said, if it's an individual that you certainly don't want to get into that in a public meeting, just there again, defer to your board chair, go to your board chair and say, I heard this. I think that we should, let the superintendent know, and how to go forward with that.
Okay.
So yeah, there would be some times where you might hear something or be told something.
Yeah, I
that
mean,
you would not
obviously,
want
we're
to
not
address
talking about
publicly.
individual, but we're talking about, let's say, for instance, school A isn't following, according to some parents and some staff members, school A is not following the policy on physical education and not using it as using PE as a disciplinary procedure. Okay. No idea if it's true or not, no whatsoever, but I'm getting 3 and 4 phone calls about it. Somebody says there's a petition out there. I certainly think that picking up the phone or texting the superintendent and saying, this is what I've heard, and that's it. I mean, that would be my role, and or certainly letting the board president know this is what I've heard, and kind of being the eyes and ears of the district administration would seem to be within a correct interpretation of my role as an elected official.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that. I mean, clearly the code of ethics anticipates that you would serve in that role, and that there would be a relationship, and get receiving information. That doesn't mean you need to go out, or any board member needs to go out on a hunt for information or delve into things. But when you hear it, then bring it back so that if it needs to be addressed, it can be addressed.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Angela, one other comment here, and I'm quite sure you're familiar with this and you've heard it before. There's a huge misunderstanding of stakeholders, constituents with board members' role. They would call, they would email, if though we as board members can take care of something that pertaining to the operation of the school district, and we can't do that. And I know that when you're trying to communicate something to people in masses in the community, that's a problem. And I'm quite sure Dr. King probably could attest to this, that probably won't ever be solved. They just feel like, now to give another example, reopening school, there are people, they feel like that we should be making some decisions on that. That's not our role. But, and I can't tell you the number of emails, phone calls that I have received, and I refer them directly to Dr. Thomas and her staff, because that's not our role. I even hear it on the TV. Gwinnett County, Cobb County, Cherokee County, Paulding County, etc. But it's not only in Athens, and that's just a misunderstanding of constituents in terms of our role as board members and the role of the superintendent and the superintendent's staff.
Yes, I agree completely. Happens a lot. And I agree also, it will never stop happening. However, it gives you the opportunity to educate your constituents on what your role is and it is not. So if somebody emails you or walks up to you and says, I want you to blah, 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 by all means, listen to them respectfully and then tell them that it is not your role to do whatever it is, but you will pass that information along.
I really appreciate what you said a few minutes ago in terms of educating the constituents, and that's exactly, I tried tremendously hard to do that in following the protocol that we have established, which is on the back of our business cards, and also honoring the chain of command. And I think that we have a 9-minute a 9-member board. And I think if boards, board members not only here would continue to do that, like I said, I don't think you ever solve the problem because it's too widespread, but I think that we can put a dent in it.
I think you can too. And the important thing is when listening to the public is that they feel listened to. For most of them, that will be enough, that somebody did listen to them and that you have given them an answer and a direction. You told them what you will do. And also if it's a problem that you can tell them to, they need to go to the teacher, they need to do whatever, and then get out of it. For some people that maybe that won't be enough just to be listened to, but for many people it is. Sam, did you want to say something?
I think along that line, you're absolutely right. That's an ongoing challenge, and it is how you articulate that to your stakeholders, your community partners, all of the above. Also, that doesn't mean that you're giving up your responsibility as a board member, because when those partners or stakeholders come to you with an issue, typically that issue is within a certain category. And when it is within a certain category, then you are able to explain to them or say to them very briefly, we do have a process for how those things are addressed. That's not within the role of the board member. However, the superintendent has an organization whereby they will take a look at whatever your allegation or your question might be, and that you will pass it on. So when you have had conversations like that as a governance team within those categories, then you become more accustomed to how your team will function as a result of an allegation or a question that a stakeholder is bringing to you. But it's real easy for board members to try to say, well, yeah, that bothers me too, and I think I better go out there and take a look and try to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you veer off in the wrong direction. So, yeah.
Estate, yeah.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Okay.
Just to follow up, the phrase chain of command has come up a lot. And I've also heard several references to going through the board president. Does chain of command also apply to the board in terms of the board needs to go through the board president? Is that because I have often seen chain of command referred to in terms of the district. Are you also saying there's a chain of command on the board?
I wasn't trying to create a chain of command necessarily, but the board president, and I think I keep calling it chair, but I do know you use president, has a certain role. And part of this will go back to what Sam referred to earlier, is the norms that you create and that you establish for how you will communicate. I think one of the times that I referred to going to the board president was if somebody wanted to go to and talk to the superintendent, and rather than just having somebody going off talking to the superintendent, at least the board chair would know what the issue was, and there needed to be this conversation. So the board chair is the one who manages your meeting and manages the information. The chain of command, and particularly the way it was used in the Code of Ethics in the earlier section we looked at, is talking about the superintendent and on down from that, so that you would honor the chain of command, as in you would be communicating with the superintendent. And if you skipped on down to going into a classroom and talking to a teacher, then you would have failed to honor the chain of command and to follow that.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to know if you had a kind of a hierarchical view of how boards work in terms of chain of command.
No, but I do think that the board president plays an important role in helping to set the agenda and managing the meeting, and kind of being the keeper. Sam, you may have a better way to explain that than I just did.
No, I mean, I think the confusion sometimes comes in. I don't think it's prevalent, but when members think that the chair has more power than any other individual, and that's not true. So it's not about the power that is, like what we said, bestowed upon the board chair. It's the responsibility that the board chair has to manage, to oversee, to facilitate, and to help move things along for your governance team. So no, I agree.
Yeah, that's a much better way to say it than I did.
I would like to
I do
add,
not want to create another hierarchy.
Ms. Palm, You know, I
Yes.
was listening to Dr. Knox, and it is interesting. The phrase chain of command has come up a lot lately in a lot of different settings. And it seems to be a word that has taken on such a negative connotation versus being seen as a way for organizational streamlining and effectiveness. Um, and it's something I think we struggle with, and I've been listening to the conversation. So when we speak about being key advisors and working together, I think that's a critical part of the relationship between a board and a superintendent, interim superintendent. But there seems to be, and I'm not speaking of this from a board perspective, but even more so from others, that school systems seem to not be seen as a business, I guess, in terms of operations. I don't know if that makes sense, but people really struggle. So I would not expect, as a customer or even an employee at Publix, to be able to call Mr. Publix. If I'm the bagger girl, I don't think I expect to be able to call Mr. Publix and say, I don't want you to have a policy about people wearing masks, right? And so people don't expect that at Publix. They don't expect that at IBM. They don't expect that at Apple. And I personally think that some of the tension that sometimes exists between board and superintendent can be due to the fact of outside influences who do not or are not in favor of that whole chain of command. And so there are efforts there to try to play one group against another to avoid having to follow that chain of command. So whether that chain of command is in the building with their school leaders, if the chain of command is at the district level. And so there seems to be a jockeying, and not necessarily between superintendent and board, but others of saying, can't you do something about this? And I've received communications in the recent past where chain of command really is spoken of negatively. And it's just my opinion that there are processes and procedures so that organizations can operate effectively and efficiently.
Mhm.
Seems to not be the mindset for school systems. And I just think that creates some of the tensions that I'm listening as people talk.
I think you're probably right. If somebody is able to go around all that and get to somebody that they want, then they probably will. That's where it is important with the relationship between the board and the superintendent, that you're all on the same page and that you stay focused on what you're doing. And don't let it distract you. There are always going to be people who try to go around or say, no, I don't like it when you do it that way. But you're right, it is part of the organizational structure and is part of how you effectively run the district, or how the superintendent effectively runs it, not that you're running it. But that you have put that trust and authority in the superintendent. So
It's a
I
shared
hear you.
governance perspective that I've seen more with schools than I see with other organizations. A shared governance, a true shared governance co-op kind of mindset that seems to infiltrate schools sometimes more than you see it with other businesses. Because at the end of the day, it is a business. It's a service business. It's a service organization. It's an educational learning organization, but we have business structures that seem to create dissatisfaction among constituents because there's an expectation of more of a co-op, shared governance kind of operations. I'm sorry, that might have been random, but I just think some of the tension comes because when we're able to talk with each other, board member and superintendent, and have dialogue, we're able to talk through most things. And I've seen that even historically, but it just seems to be a mindset of it not being a business structure.
But Dr. Thomas,
Yes.
Yeah, just one counterweight to that, because I understand where you're coming from, but one counterweight is unlike a business. I've had to knock on doors and solicit people's votes, and so I'm asking, every time I've run for office, I've gotten 1,500 people to vote for me, and I'm being asked when I knock on somebody's door, why do I want you? Why you? And of course, I can't, I certainly would not be in the position of making promises because I'm only one person out of a board of 9. So even if I was a non-board member and I could, I could say, yeah, I'm gonna promise we're gonna double the salary of teachers, or something like that. I'm only one board member once I'm elected, so I would certainly have a poor understanding. But I think that's the conflict that's always been with me in terms of I'm very comfortable with the chain of command, but because I got weaned off in the school system, so I know how the school system operates. But I being an elected official throws a real wrench in it in terms of having this constituency out there that, as Charles says, we have to educate, but at the same time, they didn't elect you to educate them either. I mean, and so you got elected because they thought that your perspective on the school system was the one that was most in line with their perspective on the school system. And so, and that's why Charles, I mean, I understand what Charles is saying in terms of what's on the back of our business card, but to simply, say, well, I mean, regardless of what anybody says, I just say, you take that to the superintendent. You take that to the superintendent. You take that to the superintendent. That's not how you develop a base among your constituency. At the same time, you can't answer their questions either because most of the questions are answered by the superintendent. So anyway, I just kind of throw that into the discussion, Dr. Thomas, in terms of kind of a uniqueness that I feel like being elected versus having worked for the central office, having worked for a principal, it's just kind of a different ball of wax.
That's a very good point, Mr. Davis. And I think that helps to frame some of what that may impact some of what we see. And I'm not even just talking about Clark. You hear it, you read about it, you see it, and it's just an interesting. But that's a great point about the answering at some level to your constituents. I'm sorry, Ms. Palm. I didn't want to.
That's okay.
I want to make one.
We're here to talk these things through, but always keep in mind that it's not just the answer you give, it's how you give it.
Yes.
That can make all the difference in the world. You're not saying to the person, that's not my job, go talk to that person. That's a terrible way to handle that. But simply explaining to them that as a board member, that's not something that you do. However, you will pass it along, or if whoever it is they need to go talk to, just start addressing the issue. It's different. And as I said before, in all honesty, of course, some people are not going to accept that and they want you to do something different. But you also need to remember that as soon as you do something different, there's also somebody over there that ain't gonna like that either. So just stay focused on the rules in play here, and keep on, and you'll be fine. Everybody won't be happy, but you'll be fine.
I think Kara had a
Ms.
question.
Palmer, go ahead.
Dr. Dykeman, and I think I saw Dr. Knox at some point, and maybe Mr. Worthy, and there may have been one other person.
I had it kind of has gone in a little bit of a different direction, but my question was about the first part of this slide here, where it says that each member will seek regular and systematic communication among the board and students, staff, and community. And we had a discussion about this the other night at our board meeting, looking at one of our policies. And we had actually taken out a part from our policy where it said that, so still in the policy, it says that teachers and other staff members can always contact the board, but we took out a part that said that the board could contact them because we aren't really supposed to be contacting school staff, teachers, school level personnel. So I'm just wondering how to
do that.
How to like elicit information without contacting people and asking.
This really is, it doesn't say that in the Code of Ethics, but when they were writing it, what they were contemplating was more like a town hall meeting where the board is there to listen to whatever issues they want to bring up to you, or it can be centered around a particular topic. But you're absolutely correct that the board members should not be going to teachers and talking to them. So your discussion was correct. And this is just more talking about a general way to do it. It's not talking about board members just going out and ferreting out information.
Okay, so if we had some, I guess here it says systematic. So if we had ways that were kind of spread out throughout the year or around the district, stuff that these are times when we'll be.
Yeah. Yeah, if you say, okay, once or twice a year or more if you need it, then you will hold a town hall meeting, or if you use a different term, and let the public come. One of the ways that you do that is your budget hearings. Almost nobody comes to those, but the opportunity is there for them to come and talk to you about the budget. So that's one example of when you do it and how that's done.
Okay.
Somebody else? Okay. The fifth domain is board meetings. We've talked about some of this.
Actually, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
There is another question.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I can ask the question, but I do want some clarity on it. Would it be inappropriate for board members to attend PTO meetings, not as a guest speaker or someone there to talk, but to get an understanding of kind of what's going on within each of the schools within their districts? I just want some guidance on whether that's appropriate or seen as inappropriate contact.
That would be one of the things that the board would talk about in setting their norms and who speaks for the board and who can speak publicly. And so that would be something for the board to decide among themselves. There's no prohibition against that, anything that we've talked about tonight, but it would just be something that you would decide together.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. And I think Mr. Worthy had a question.
Well, I didn't have a question. I was going to make a comment pertaining to what Dr. Thomas said, and also a comment where Greg Davis referred to. And what I wanted to say, Dr. Thomas made a powerful statement when she mentioned about shared governance. And I wanted to just say, I ran a shared governance school, and it went very well. But one thing I had to say and make it clear to the faculty and staff, now the buck gonna start with me. And the reason for that, because if something was going wrong, or someone had done something that they shouldn't have done, the superintendent gonna come see me, not a department head or a teacher, whomever. But shared governance, Dr. Thomas, I wanted to put that in. It does work, but the same as with the superintendent. Things that the superintendent's supposed to be doing, we hold the superintendent accountable, etc. But like I said, the buck got to stop somewhere, because you can't have multiple leaders.
That's true. Somebody has a last word.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. Domain 5 is board meetings, and it says each member will, and you can see there. The one that seems to cause issues is working with other board members in a spirit of harmony and cooperation in spite of differences of opinion that may arise during the discussion and resolution of issues at a board meeting. You are all elected, each from your own district. You may or may not have known each other before you got on the board. And sometimes when there are major disagreements among board members, or for instance, somebody who just ran for the board and they ran completely opposite to what the existing board is doing, it can cause hard feelings. And sometimes people just get so entrenched in disagreeing with each other and not trusting each other that it bleeds over into the business of the district. And so the Code of Ethics says that you will in fact work with each other in a spirit of harmony and cooperation, in spite of any differences of opinion that you have. And so if it gets to a point where there is a contentious argument, disagreeing with each other is not a problem. It's sort of like what I said a while ago. It's not disagreeing with each other, it's how you say it, and how you treat each other, and whether you can move past that. And there have been some boards that we have seen that truly struggle with this, and how to work together. So you just have to keep in mind that your policy says you're going to do it. And remember that everybody is a grown-up and that you expect each other to act ethically and professionally. And it's nice when everybody likes each other, but if you don't, that's okay. You still got a job to do. Still on the board meeting issue, here's another troublemaker, maintaining confidentiality of what happens in executive session. Sometimes, particularly when people don't like what just happened in executive session, they decide to come out and tell somebody. Or sometimes something wonderful is happening and you're so excited you just can't wait to tell somebody, and you just know that person is not going to tell someone. They always do. And it is part of your job as a board member to go into executive session, to listen to the discussion, participate in whatever discussion takes place, and maintain the confidentiality of whatever happened in that room. Whatever happened in that room stays in that room. But that one is one that has gotten people into trouble. The next one is similar to what we just talked about a minute ago. Express your opinions before the votes are cast, but after the board vote, abide by and support all the majority decisions of the board. As I said at the beginning, this was adopted in 2010. Over the years, there came to be kind of a movement among some board members to hold this over other board members' heads and say, you can't do that. You can't disagree with me. There was never anything wrong with disagreeing with each other. It was just that once the vote was taken and the majority decision had been made, then all the board members would abide by it. So in 2016, the legislature came back and added to a different code section, totally out of Title 20, that a local board shall not adopt or follow any code of ethics which prevents the members of the board from discussing freely the policies and actions of such a board outside a board meeting. There were some legislators who looked at the code of ethics and felt that it did in fact infringe on board members' First Amendment rights. And so they made that change, and that's the only change that has been made to the code of ethics since it was originally done. So you still maintain your free speech rights as an individual, but as an elected official, you also have to keep in mind the role that you play. And once you've been elected a board member, the school committee always looks at you as a board member. You may not be acting in your as in your capacity as a board member at the moment, but when you're out doing things, they still see you as a member of the board. And so anyway, so Code of Ethics says that express all the opinions you want before the vote's cast, once the decision has been made to support it. Yes.
So we just went around and around about whether to add the word support or not. So it looks like that the word support is in the Model code?
It's in the code of ethics.
Okay. All right, well, we're now consistent because we put it back in. We had taken it out.
All right.
Okay. The next domain is on personnel.
I had a question about from the last domain, sorry.
Oh, sure.
And it's about executive session and so is it correct that there are no minutes of executive session meetings?
No, that is not correct. The law requires that minutes be taken in executive session, but those minutes are not made public. The only time those minutes are used is if there is a court case and the judge will view them in his chambers or her chambers.
Okay, so we can have minutes of executive session so that we know what took place in case of later executive session.
Yeah, the Open Meetings Act specifies what is supposed to be in those minutes. So you might take a look at that. It's I can send you the code section for it. Or you can ask your school board attorney. But anyway, it's spelled out in there what is supposed to be in those minutes.
Okay.
That's helpful, Ms. Palm. It's ironic you said that, Dr. Dykeman, because I just asked Ms. Palmer that this week. I said, who's supposed to remember what happened? And not intentionally, it's just we discussed so much. So I'll follow up with Attorney Pruitt about the Open Meetings Act.
Okay.
Ms. Palmer,
They added that in 2012 and people forget it, so.
May
Yeah.
I jump in on the prior point about the word support? That actually is no longer in the Model Code of Ethics from the State Board of Education. They revised the Model Code after that statute was passed, and so there's now 8 instead of 7 under domain 5, and number 8 says abide by, but it does not say support.
Okay.
So how come our policy says support?
Because you didn't take my suggestion to adopt the model code word for word.
Oh, God. Yeah, I mean, that gets back to the whole discussion that we had with the law in 2016 and how board members up until that point could not express an individual opinion after the vote, unlike county commissioners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, well, shoot myself in the foot because I'm on the policy committee.
Greg, that's my fault because I thought that the word support really did belong.
Well, I want to be consistent with on the state. So and I'm not faulting you, John, because I should have checked it as much as you. So,
But what I understood is we can add things to the code of ethics. We just can't subtract anything. So
Right.
that's
we
my
had
understanding.
we had a discussion. We had several discussions about leaving in the word support. And we all voted to leave in or put back in the word support because of how we felt as a board. So I think we probably leave it for now and think about it down the road after we get through all the other 200 policies we have to get through.
So I'm still trying to figure out what that means. If there is a if there is a budget that goes before the board for a vote, and the vote is 8-1, and I'm the one person, and I come home. Now, I'm not talking to the press. I'm not being public about it. I'm not speaking on behalf of the board. I'm just going home to my neighborhood and my constituents, and they say, "Well, why did you vote against the budget?" I can't tell you that. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me.
That's not what that means.
No, you can tell them why you voted no. The idea of the previous version of saying that you were going to abide by it, and it still says you're going to abide by the decision, is that you wouldn't go out and campaign against the board. That you wouldn't continue to look for support for your position, but you were always able to answer the question of why did you vote the way that you did, or even why did the board do this? And you could say, I voted this way, that was my belief, but the board decided to do this and then just drop it.
Yeah, and that was precisely why I wanted to have support in it, because I don't want to have a situation where one of our board members doesn't like a vote and then goes out and campaigns against it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. Lots of good
Angela,
discussion. Yes.
may I ask, mention something before you move forward? I think you brought about some clarity with the minutes of the executive session, because when, and I can't recall what law that is in, with the affidavit that was created, I had several questions about that, and I was told now that the affidavits, that's the minutes. That's what I was told.
No.
Okay, so
The affidavit was already required before was required to be signed by the board chair, that the executive session was in fact for this purpose, and that's all that happened. And then in 2012, the Open Meetings and Open Records Acts were both revised. And in that revision, as it was done, the Attorney General at the time, Sam Mullins, was a former county commissioner. And so he was certainly aware of a number of issues that happened. And so he was the one who wanted the requirement that minutes be done in the executive session, because until then they were not required. And it was pretty much accepted that you didn't write anything down that happened in there. And so that requirement was added. The affidavit predated that. And so the affidavit still has to be done. The board decides whether it is only the board chair that signs it or whether the entire board signs that affidavit, and it is attached to the minutes, the regular minutes, not the executive session minutes. So they're two separate things.
And
okay.
with those notes, where are they kept?
They would have to be kept somewhere private so that they couldn't be accessed. It's certainly not online, and you're like, if you post your regular minutes, they wouldn't be posted like that. They would have to be kept somewhere that would be private, so that if they were needed for a case, that they could be accessed, but that they wouldn't be discovered or found. But the law does not say where to put them. It just says to keep them, and that they are not made public, and that they would only be used by the judge in camera.
Is that with those notes, like who would take them? Like, is that like a staff person? Is it a board member? Is it the superintendent?
The law does not specify who takes it, so that would be your choice how you do that.
So just to be clear, we should have been doing minutes in addition to the affidavit.
Correct.
For executive session meetings. And that
Correct.
changed in 2012?
Correct.
That's
Ooh,
correct.
thank you.
You have been, Dr. Knox. You have two forms in your policy manual that are exhibits to your policy on executive sessions. One is the affidavit, one is a form for minutes. Our firm developed that, and it contains all the requirements referenced in 5014-1.
Thank you, Mike. I was like, I know we had talked about this before, but all right, thank you. Now I think, but to let me say, my concern is that sometimes we don't get into any specificity in our minutes and meeting minutes. And I've been researching the history of education in Georgia. And as I read the minutes of some of the earlier board members, they get down to calling names and all kind of crazy things that are in there. And I'm like, boy, you would never find anything like this in our minutes. So bears having a conversation about. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, ready to go on?
Sure.
All right. Personnel. That you will consider the employment of personnel only after receiving and considering the recommendation of the superintendent. And we've talked about this a couple of times early on tonight. And so you receive the recommendation of the superintendent and you act on that. And secondly, that you will support the employment of personnel who are best qualified to serve as employees in the school system. There's other things within that domain, but those are the two areas that tend to cause trouble. Any questions on that part?
I want to say something, but I don't even know what to say right now. I'll come back. I'll think on it. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And also the code of ethics includes conduct as a board member. Just devoting time and being prepared for your board meeting and keeping up with your duties, but communicating in a respectful, professional manner with and about fellow board members is another part of it. That's very similar to other parts that you've already seen within the code of ethics tonight. And so it's just one more reminder of how to treat each other and talk to each other. And also take no private action that will compromise the board or school system administration, so that you would not do anything in your private life or separately from the board that would compromise anything that the board is doing. And also, as we talk through these things, you can also see where they are often general statements. And as you can tell from all the questions that we've had, the discussion that we've had, a lot of times things come up and you have to wonder, how does that fit into this? And so that's part of making sure you understand completely what is in this policy and what it means operationally as you move forward. So just a few questions to think about as you look at the code of ethics and go back and review it. You do have to review it once a year and sign that you've done that. So just thinking about which parts do the board or some of the members need to be more intentional about following. How would you hold yourselves accountable for violating it if you felt that somebody did? Usually, if you're in compliance with the Code of Ethics, which is BH, BBD, which is also often mentioned as the Board Superintendent Relations Policy, is usually taken care of, because a lot of times where the trouble comes is between the board and the superintendent, and that gray area that both of you kind of operate in sometimes. Sometimes it's very clear what is the board's role and what the superintendent's, and some things both of you operate in, for instance, the budget, and adopting that and getting financial information. And so usually the Code of Ethics, if you follow that, then that helps solve a number of the other issues. Okay. Speaking of affidavits, when you qualify for office, there is a board member affidavit specific to those who are qualifying to run for the local board. And so you sign that in addition to the other stuff that you sign when you qualify, that you have to affirm that you have read and understand the Code of Ethics and Conflict of Interest provisions, and that you agree to abide by them. That you agree to annually disclose compliance with the state board's policy on training, the Code of Ethics and Conflict of Interest provisions, and that annual disclosure, whenever you do that, they do it on the same sheet, I think, as the training requirements. Anyway, you're certifying that you have complied with the Code of Ethics, Conflict of Interest, and the training requirements. So following the Code of Ethics, reading it, understanding it, following it, is actually a condition of eligibility for office. So it's not only for a policy as you're serving on the board, but when you want to run again, or when you want to run the first time, it is a condition of eligibility. And then each year you do have to sign off that you have complied with the Code of Ethics, Conflict of Interest, and that you have met the training requirements.
You know, Angela, Angela?
Yeah.
I've always gotten stuck on that, because when I go to the Board of Elections and sign the paperwork, there's something in there that says that I do not receive any state monies. And I forget exactly how it's worded. And the trouble is I collect TRS. And so I've, you know, I'm sure that's not included, but that's always kind of befuddled me the way that's worded. But
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the language there. So I don't know, but my guess is that it's on the general affidavit for all candidates. And we certainly have a lot of people in office who are getting TRS or other state retirement, legislative retirement, for instance.
You're correct, Ms. Palm, and that's a pretty old language, but what it says in effect is that you're not the holder of money owed to the state,
Okay.
but you're withholding from the state.
Okay. So don't hang on to any state money and you're fine. Okay. Last part of what can happen and the impact of following the policies is accreditation. As we went through earlier, the two agencies that do accreditation, this really is aimed towards Cognia's designation. In 2010, part of that whole piece of legislation was that when a board was placed at the level prior to loss of accreditation due to board governance issues, then they would be required to have a hearing before the state board regarding their possible suspension and removal from office. And the state board would hold the hearing or hearings, depending on the situation, and make a recommendation to the governor whether or not the board should be removed. The board members individually then, if they chose to do so, if they had been removed, could appeal and have an administrative judge hearing. Later on, it was also added to the code section that should you choose to appeal it and fight it, that that public money cannot be used for attorney fees or the expenses of litigation. So there is, now the current governor does not seem to be inclined to follow this or to utilize this statute, but I don't know, that could change. So just wanting to make sure that you do understand. Cognia has changed their labels numerous times since this passed in 2010, which is one of the reasons why I argued against using that. They're a private entity. They can do whatever they want to. They can change their labels, change their roles, and they have done both a lot of times. So right now with Cognia, you were either accredited or you were accredited under review. When that law was written, there were 4 levels. And so when you hit the last one, that was when this statute kicked in. Currently, when you're accredited under review, technically, anybody who falls in that, and a lot of districts do get that designation from them, it would fall into this if you have issues related to board governance, which are those 2 standards, 2 of the 3 that were cited in your report. So just keep in mind that that is possible. Here's a list of districts that statute has been applied to over the years. I think there might be one more that I missed here. The ones in red were the ones who were actually removed. Miller and Dooley were removed in total. DeKalb was removed except for the members who had just been elected. So the statute has previously been taken very seriously, and it has been used to remove local boards from office. So just keep that in mind.
Angela, what about, can you go back to that slide?
Uh-huh.
I was looking for Clayton County.
Thank you. So was I.
This statute passed after the Clayton County issue.
Okay.
That was
okay. I got
that
you.
was
okay.
part of what kicked off this whole thing.
Well, I see Dooley County in there, and I read about them. It was 5 of them. All 5 were ejected.
Yes,
they had a total mess there.
Yeah.
South Georgia. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but that's why Clayton County is not on it.
Okay.
Angela, now they've told us that after accredited under review, there's accredited with conditions.
That was my question. I thought you told us we were
Right.
one level above the bottom level.
That's what they told us.
Okay, they've changed things since the last time I looked at their stuff. They keep changing it and it makes it so hard to do this and to keep up with it. Because when they did change it and it was just accredited and accredited under review. And when they did that, and I said, you know, guys, you're going to have a whole pile of them getting referred to the state board if there's not another level. So maybe they went back and added another one, it sounds like.
What was shared with me, trying to see on what date, and then I created a PowerPoint for the board based on that.
I'm glad they did because it was either going to be totally ignored or it was going to be a big mess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll look that up as well while we're,
Okay.
but that was the last that I was told by Dr. Harrison with them.
Okay.
It was on page 11 where they went through the status, the different levels.
Thank you, Dr. Gant.
I think that's what it's showing up in the link of the,
Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
we're all
I just
learning
looked it up.
things tonight.
I just put the 4 levels in the
Yes.
Chat.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
So that would then help us with that then, right? With
Yes, so as long as you're accredited under review and there are other conditions below you, then you're not at the level to worry about yet. So when they come back in December and they'll look for the progress that you've made on the things they had in the January report, and hopefully move you back to totally accredited or at least show that you have made a lot of progress because you've certainly worked hard.
Yeah, that was my understanding, that we were not in any danger of being not accredited anytime soon until we go through at least a couple of years of trying hard. But
Yes.
that was based on your presentation the other night, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Gant.
that's correct. I don't know about the couple of years. I wish that part I heard, but I do know it could be a couple of visits of them coming back, but those visits could take place
Mhm.
for 6 months. They could be a 3-month, just depending on what they found.
I
But they
see.
say that we wouldn't jump just from accredited under review to non-accredited unless something egregious occurred. We could stay at accredited under review. They could come, say we're making progress, even though we haven't met all of the recommendations, we could stay under review. They could come and say, you're doing great. We could go up to accredited. They could come and have more concerns and we could move to conditions. But they said it wasn't not likely that we would jump. It's not normal to jump from under review to loss or non-accredited unless something severe, but it would take a few rounds of visits normally. But that, I don't know about the timeline on that.
Okay. I
Right.
thought it was an annual process, so that's where I jumped to years, but they could come
Right.
sooner. Okay.
Right, like the last time
Yeah.
they came, it's been, what they came and then they gave us, by the time we got the report, that's the problem. So it was December and it's December again because it took that long with the report. So I could see.
Well, Dr. Thomas, aren't they supposed to give us a partial review in November? That was my, say that again?
I'm not sure. What do you mean by partial review?
Well, they let the school district know or let you know as superintendent, you know, the progress that we have made, whatever else, et cetera. That was my understanding when they sent the, when was it, in April, I believe.
So they told us that they would schedule the next visit to come, and I hadn't even had an opportunity to share this with Dr. Gant, so I apologize because I had this meeting today, because they told me, and I shared with you all last week, that they were going to let me know by Friday what the plans were, and on Friday they gave me a meeting for today with our lead evaluator, and they will be coming in December. I now have a meeting with him tomorrow or Friday, I'm not sure, I'm sorry, to look at dates for that visit, and I will be able to share that with you all. but they will be here in December for their follow-up visit to determine our progress toward the directives and recommendations.
Okay,
Yes, and my understanding too was if the progress has not been assessed, then that may result in a step down. But as you mentioned, not like skipping over a step unless it was significant
Mhm.
concern.
Mhm.
But either way, even a step down is concerning.
Right. That's not our goal.
Okay, the last part of what we're going to talk about is policy review and development. And this is where you sort of look at what is policy and what is administrative regulation. And it can get confusing for some people. But a policy is about a general topic. It's your statement giving it administrative actions. I think about it kind of like how you want it to run when you're not there. So it's like the board is leaving the instructions for how the administration will move forward whenever you're not present to make decisions. And it's also something that's applicable over time. Sometimes whenever there is something that comes up, it's never happened before, and people say, oh, we need a policy about this. But if it's never happened before, is it going to be applicable over time? Is it going to be something that continues? If it's not, then just think about whether you actually do or not need a policy. You communicate it to all stakeholders. Your policies are public documents. It has the force of law. So when you do a policy, why are you doing the policy to begin with? Why is it important to the district? And it may just be that you're doing it because a state or federal law passed and said you had to do it. But it also could be a discretionary policy that you simply want to have in your district. What is it that you're doing? Are you directing somebody to do something? Are you authorizing the superintendent or the superintendent's designee to do something? Are there any relevant legal definitions or any terms that need to be defined within the policy so that it's clear what it means and what it's pertaining to? Who's responsible? That goes back to who you're delegating something to. And is there any other necessary information to express what you want to have happen that's not in there? Being careful not to get into detailed procedures, but just making sure that you have the information that you want in there. So the policy is from the board side, of course.
Angela, can you go back to, okay, okay, that's the one, authority. The board adopts, directs, authorizes. Are you talking about authorizing or directing the superintendent to do something?
Well, your policies, when you read through your policies, you'll see they start out different ways. Sometimes the board is directing the superintendent or somebody to do something, and sometimes you're simply authorizing. For instance, the recess, the statute regarding recess. You might authorize the superintendent to move forward with developing recess, or you might be authorizing the principals of the schools to decide how recess would be handled in each school. So those are just the different words that are used within the policy, that you're adopting this policy to say this is how you're going to handle, my mind's going blank, a conduct issue. Or you might be doing the policy to direct somebody to do something, or you're simply authorizing. Spending, you would authorize the superintendent to make purchases up to a certain amount without board approval. So that's what that means.
Okay, well, the reason I raised that question, especially the word direct, somewhere in my training over the 16 years that I've served on this board, that would be the same as telling the superintendent what to do, and you can't, and board members can't do that.
Ooh.
Well,
The superintendent reports to the board. So it depends on how you want to do that. You might never want to use that word, and that's fine.
that, and some of the training sessions that I've been in nationally and
Mhm.
also through GSBA, I think what you said is exactly what they said, because that word direct, to give a person a directive, that's strong language. I think you're right.
I guess it's in the eye of the beholder, because I don't take it as a massive power play and saying you're going to do this. When you use the word shall in a policy, you're saying you're going to do this.
Yeah, shall, must.
So it's kind of, in my mind, I see it the same way. Clearly you don't, and that's fine. So if you don't like that word, don't use that word.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm just sticking to the training that I had.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. All right. Administrative regulations are those things that are developed to implement policy. They're much more precise statements with specific details than you would see in a board policy. It's related to a specific issue rather than something more broad. Is often a directive for staff and how the staff will carry out and implement whatever it is. It's communicated mainly to the staff. You may have some regulations included in your policy manual, but you don't have to. And it's subject to change without board approval. The regulations are the superintendent's purview and would not need to come to you unless you have directed otherwise.
So before we move,
So, yeah.
we
So,
spent a
Linda-
lot of time on that one because, again, just following your definition, and that is that the regulations are pretty much operational, and the policy was the governance of that. And so you're saying they don't necessarily have to come to the board, but we made a rule that when we were reviewing the regs, when we were reviewing policies, this is back when I was on the policy committee years ago, we would have the regs brought as well so that we could keep everything in sync. We wouldn't have a policy change with a reg out there that was supporting something that no longer was valid. But at that time, we maintained that separation to keep just the policy and the regs. We reviewed them, but we did not approve them. And so that's the question that I have. And I don't think we should approve them because it's operational, but should we? How do we handle regs and policies?
The regs should implement the policy. So the policy comes first and the regs carry out as how you're going to do whatever that policy says. And so if you change the policy, then the superintendent would need to go or have staff look at the regs to adapt them to whatever the change in the policy was. Now, I will also say that boards do things differently. And where one local board might decide that they're going to have the superintendent handle something and it doesn't come to them, another board will say, no, thank you very much. We will vote on that. And so, I mean, somebody mentioned the opening the schools earlier, and I've seen some districts where the local board wants to vote on the reopening plan. And others say, no, that's an administrative function and we want to know about it. We want to know what the plan is, but it's not our job to vote on it. So generally speaking, regulations are an administrative function and they are not approved by the board. But the board has every right to say, no, maybe the regulation for this policy we want to do. But generally speaking, that's one way you split who's doing what.
So there's nothing wrong with asking to approve the regs. We don't have to write the regs, but we can approve them if we want to. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yes. No.
Angela, may I add something?
Yes, Sam. Yes.
I agree, but I think that one thing that you mentioned, Angela, and that the board and the superintendent would stay focused on with, if you decide as a board that you're going to get in the business of approving the regs, you need to have a certain understanding with your superintendent, because the reg is developed by the superintendent and her administration or her designee to carry out the intent of the policy that you developed. And you delegated authority to her with her expertise and her administration to determine the wisdom and the expertise around how to implement that. And so that's just one piece that I'll mention there. And if you get into the business of approving regs, I think the potential problem could present itself when and if there is a difference in direction in that reg that's coming from your superintendent to you, if that makes sense. So just one caution there. Angela, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. And as you talked, I was thinking back to the code of ethics and having honoring the superintendent's authority in day-to-day operations. And so I would say that there is nothing in law that prohibits you from doing it. But I think that there is a lot in the regulatory stuff that we went through earlier tonight that would clearly indicate that the day-to-day operations and how that's carried out is the superintendent's job, and that you have hired that person to delegate that to. And I think Sam's right, that's if you decided that you were going to approve every regulation, that would be a real slippery slope. That's why I said earlier, if you thought there was a particular policy that you wanted to say, yeah, we want to approve how this is carried out.
So for example,
That would be
our code
very
of conduct is a reg. And I think all of us want to be involved in the development of the code of conduct or have discussions about that. Is that a good example of one that we're not? Or disciplinary?
Yeah, I mean, your discipline policy, I can see that. Sam, what would you say to that?
That is a good example. And that's why I mentioned that it goes back to where there's a difference in your approach. And that's why it speaks to alignment in your strategic plan. And that's why it goes back to the fact that all of you as a governance team should have developed that, and you are the drivers behind the priorities that you have. When that happens, then your policies are developed aligned with your strategic plan. And so everything's in sync, and it takes away a lot of the potential problem when that happens, because then your superintendent moves forward and she develops, her administration develops regulations to carry out the spirit of your priorities in that blueprint. And with the code of conduct, of course, it is different because there are a lot of moving parts in code of conduct, and you want to be up close and personal with whether or not you're meeting the expectations in your policy. And so that could be one that you bring to the table, but it should not be an example of massive differences in terms of what you're doing if you've done all of the other pieces right. Yeah.
Could I just
Dr.
give a bit of
King.
Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, I was just going to give a bit of historical perspective on how regulations came to be as they are in Clark County School District. What Dr. King described, the slippery slope, is exactly what happened. The policy committee wanted to review all regs. That fairly quickly morphed into the policy committee rewriting the regs just as they would rewrite the policy proposals. And the superintendent at the time said, well, if you're going to do that, you might as well vote on them. And so they did, and that's the way it's been ever since.
And I guess I've always been confused by that. So if the superintendent decides that they want to write a reg to a policy, is that something that we are required to know about, or is just put in the policy manual? How does that communication? I thought the reason why we were doing it, I'm glad to hear that history. I thought it was so that the communication could kind of stay together. Like, we currently work on it together and then we approve it and then it's done. So I thought that was why, but I'm glad to hear. I never knew the history of why it was even like that. So can they, so do they just make a reg up and then just stick it in when they decide they need to have a reg to a policy? How does that, I guess I don't know how that works since we've been doing it this
Well,
way.
you would do the policy as a board, and the superintendent and the staff would do the regulations to implement what the policy says. Now, you've hired the superintendent to do a job, so you would be expecting them to do the job. And a large part of the job is implementing the policies. And so it seems odd to me that you would expect the superintendent to come tell you that they're doing the regulation, because that you would expect them to be doing that, because you would have the expectation that they're doing their job. So
Well, I guess not. I guess based on the way that we were doing it, yeah, I expect them to do their job. But I was wondering the way that, because of the way that we were taught to do the policy with the regs together, I just wanted to know, do they put those policies in, and do we, so there's never any discussion or anything, it's just, they're just put there. So there's no expectation for the board to even know what's going on with the regulations. I understand it should align with the strategic plan, I get all that. But once they do that, that has nothing to do with the board. I guess that's what I'm asking.
And in my view, no,
That's
as a
what
general practice. Now, as Jaeger pointed out, there are some things that you would hold out and that the board would want to be a part of. And the regulation doesn't have to go in your policy manual. It can or cannot. So that's where you can stop working and let the superintendent do their job. Yes.
Can I also add a little bit of historical perspective and add it to what Mike has said, but maybe from a different perspective. First off, is that one thing we're not talking about is that in Clark County, as in I'm sure every school system, every department has their own manual, their own way of doing things that are as concrete. I mean, I would hate to see how heavy the human resources manual is in terms of how they conduct interviews, background checks, vet employees, all this kind of stuff. We don't see that. We don't want to see that. That has never been an issue. And so when I look at our regulations, a lot of times as we go through policy, we find out that the reg doesn't add anything to the policy. And so we've eliminated a lot of regs. The one historical conversation that we had dealing with a regulation dealt around when we became a charter school system. And what we tried to do within our charter is to put in the whole fair dismissal legislation passed by the state legislature umpteen years ago. And we were told when we introduced our charter to the state, no, you cannot do that. You will have to do that by policy. So what we did was we rewrote a policy that was kind of vague, but said, we really respect the rights of employees who have tenure. And we had a lot of pushback from the community. So what we did was we have a GBN talks about professional personnel termination. That's real general. We're going to treat everybody right. But then the regulation took the entire body of the Fair Dismissal Act that's on state books that we were not allowed to put into our charter. And so we put it as part of a regulation. And that to me was the right thing to do. I mean, we didn't want the whole thing in policy, but we wanted it in regulation so that the next superintendent can't just come along and says, the heck with this. I want to be able to change the process of fair dismissal according to my experience in Mississippi. So I don't want to make a big deal out of this. Another issue that we had was dealing with purchasing, where we have a policy that says that the superintendent purchases. Okay, fair enough. But what we wanted after great discussion in the last couple of years is we wanted local vendors to be considered. We didn't want that part of the policy. It became part of a regulation that said that the superintendent and his staff or her staff, when they're out doing RFPs, will consider the local orientation of the product or service being requested. Now, I know there's a lot of state law in there, and I don't want to misstate and Mike to get all over me for saying that I did something illegal. But that's another regulation that we have that's not part of our policy. But a lot of what we've done within the policy committee is do away with regs. And it doesn't talk about most of our regs don't talk about, well, anyway, I'll hush up. But those were my two examples that make me kind of passionate about wanting to have some type of input in terms of the kind of regs we have in the Clark County School District.
Y'all have a lot of discussion to do.
Angela, that's
Yes.
why I raised the question that I raised earlier in terms of writing policies that is sometime in the near future, it may move away from boards of education, and the superintendent and his staff or her staff would do this. And I said earlier, you do a ton of work in the state legislature. And from what I've been told, that may be coming down the pike sometime in the near future there. And it's because of the fact that superintendents being trained educators and their staff members being trained educators, they have the skill set to write these policies and not board members. That's one of the reasons why I raised that question. That may be something that you can check on, Angela.
Okay, thank you. All right, here's just a simple comparison of the two between policy and administrative regulations. It's a repeat of what we just went through. I'll just keep on. And the purpose of a policy manual, the reason why you do have that book that you put the policies in there, obviously you want to have a place where everything is together and that it's an organized way to operate and to ensure that you're legally compliant. But also hopefully that it's empowering to the staff, that it's not just about compliance. We talked about this earlier, informing the employees, the students, the public about what is accepted and what is expected behavior. And to communicate to those groups how you're going to conduct your business. The source of policies, a lot of your policies are just in response to federal and state requirements. For instance, a wellness policy is a federal requirement, code of ethics is state. Also, we have the State Board of Education rules, along with their standards for local boards. Sometimes the standards refer to behavior that there's not a requirement anywhere else about it, but clearly they expect it. The accrediting agencies may create standards that would require you to have certain policies. Clearly, they both rely on having a code of ethics. Auditors, and auditors create problems sometimes because they, along with a lot of people, use the word policy when what they mean is procedure. So you may have an audit at some point and the auditor says, where's your policy on blah, 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 blah. And you don't have one, and then we get calls, it's like, what is this? And what they really mean is, how do you do this? How do you ensure that this happens? So they're really looking for what your process is or what your procedure is. They're not really looking for a board adopted policy. So sometimes when you're talking to other agencies and they're telling your school district you need a policy on something, you need to go a little bit further and clarify for sure what it is that they're talking about. Revising and reviewing, it should be done regularly, and you do that in response to the same things that make you have a policy to begin with. Something changes, there's a court decision, there's a change in regulations, change in guidance, there may be audit findings that would lead to changes in policy. There may be a different process or procedure that you want, a new program that would require a new policy, or just addressing specific situations. I'm kind of flipping through this because a lot of it we've talked about in other ways. And so obviously, if you're going to revise your policy, you would review your existing policy in light of whatever the change was to see what it is exactly would need to be changed, or identifying where new policies are needed. Collaborate with the policy committee, the administrators, the community on developing them. You can, of course, use GSBA resources. You get our policy updates, which include sample policies whenever we think it's necessary. Your school district attorney, any federal state guidance that has been issued around certain topics. There may be model policies. Sometimes the State Department is required to create model policies, and you can use that or use something different. You can also search the policy manuals that are online and look for samples of how other districts are handling whatever the issue is. It takes a team and it's a process. You identify the problem, decide what it is you need to have in policy, adopt it, implement it, and then evaluate, is this working, is it not working? Do we need to do something different? So basically you need to decide two things. One is, what issue are you addressing? And second, what's the desired outcome? And write the policy to address whatever the need is, and then to hopefully arrive at whatever your desired outcome is. One example for a policy is on financial controls. The state board standards actually refer to this. And so on financial controls, who can authorize the payments, under what circumstances, and for how much? Another example might be the promotion and retention statute. If you're following that as a charter system, you don't have to. But if you're following that, would you add to the state requirements? Would you do it differently? Or since that has been waived for you as a charter system, do you have another process for that? Is that something that you want to have a policy on? Some questions to think about as you work on policies. Is there existing legal authority that determines how you handle it, no matter what it is you want to do? There may already be a law that says you have to do it this way. And again, as a charter system, you are out of a lot of those state regulations. For instance, Fair Dismissal Act, since Greg mentioned that just a few minutes ago. Also think about, does it need to be a board policy? Is this something that would be better handled in an employee handbook or a student handbook? Make sure that if you're going to make it a policy, it's something that can be enforced. Board policy shouldn't be something that are wishful thinking. Is it something that could be better accomplished through administrative regulations rather than board policy? And also, just as a double check, if there's any forms or paperwork related to whatever it is you're working on, and you make changes to that, make sure that you also make changes to that paperwork or forms so that they are aligned with whatever changes you're making in the policies. That's kind of a repeat. Do I have any questions? I'm sort of just moving through here. Okay. Should definitions be added? This kind of repeats what we were talking
Actually,
about.
I had a quick question, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So we are in the process of reviewing all of our policies in response to the Cognia report that noted that we have a lot of out-of-date policies. And so when you say regular review, approximately what timeline do you recommend?
It seems like about every 3 years is a good time to do that. Although there are some boards that have it set up so that they regularly take a few policies or one section at a time and do that.
I think we have a policy that says every 5 years.
Okay.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Check
I
your
just-
policies to see what your policy says.
No, I
You're
was
correct.
asking for your opinion on how often
Yeah.
we should be reviewing, because we
Yeah.
have policies on the books that have not been officially reviewed since 1983.
Might have been some changes since then.
Yeah, so we are going through that process. And it's going to take us a little while to do it, but we're working on it.
Okay. Okay. All right. And your attorney, don't forget your attorney. And the policy work, particularly if there's any litigation that has occurred around whatever the topic is, or if it's in the courts. If it's a controversial topic in the community, is helpful to have your attorney involved in it, just so that you make sure that you've crossed all the legal T's and dotted the I's there. And if you're considering language that goes beyond the scope of the law, if it's a policy that's in response to a statute and it says it must include this and has a laundry list of things, and you decide you want something in addition to it, make sure you run that by your attorney, so you make sure that you're not creating any additional liability or risk or contradicting something else. And this follows the process of the policy going to the board draft, and then the board gets it and laying it on the table to get feedback, and then finally adopting it. And to your question, establish a policy review schedule. If you have a policy that says 5 years, you may want to look at that. You may decide 5 years is fine. And that would be coming across a legal requirement that says when you're going to review something. And just try to ensure there's flexibility for revisions built in based on law and regulations, the court decisions. Pretty much you have to consider all of those things. Another one, local legislation, if you're looking at anything related to the board composition or terms or any of that. Then you probably have local legislation related to filling a vacancy or some of the other things. And when you are reviewing your policies and making revisions, especially when you're redoing the whole thing, don't forget to look at the other documents that are impacted by policies, the handbooks, the student handbooks, the employee handbooks, the budget financial documents that's probably a lesser impact. But again, looking at your strategic plan and your flexibility contract, keep all of those things in mind to try to keep everything aligned and together. Just think about it as the best educational interest of the students. Try to make sure that you have consistency, especially when policies are dealing with the same topic and part of it may be in one and part of it's in another one. And so try to make sure that you're consistent across the board, that it supports any policy that you do supports the mission and the goals of the district, supports the strategic plan. If there's any current research around a topic that you're working on, that you try to address that. And that the policies really are designed to sustain effective governance. You don't have policies just to meet the law. You're trying to create the policies and the foundation for a very effective school district that's focused on student achievement. And another reason for your policies is in legal disputes, the first question is going to be is, what does your policy say? So just making sure that your policies are clear and consistent, and that nothing contradicts each other. A change in the law might make your policy obsolete, but you're the only one that can rescind it. So if the law changes and you don't need a policy anymore, or it's whatever was in it is obsolete, you're the one to rescind it. And it is the board's responsibility to adopt new policies and revise existing ones in light of any changes and to make sure that you're operating under the most recent legal requirements. So we're close to the end, guys. Yes.
So my question is, when I was in a new board training, we were told about access to other districts around the state, the policies of other districts around the state. You mentioned having access to GSBA model policies. As a board member here in Athens-Clarke County, where we use board docs, do we have to be using Simbly to have access to those other policies and those model policies, or can we do it as a board
No,
docs person?
you can access other Simbly sites. Generally, the way I get to them is I go to the Department of Education Simbly site. If you go to the Department of Education's website and click on the state board, they use Simbly, and so the board agendas and all that is on Simbly. And once you're on there, the front page, there's a drop-down box, and you can go to any district you want to, and you can search there. I think you were on the board whenever y'all did have Simbly, so you may remember how to do the searches in there.
I was not, but
You were not, okay.
others maybe, but.
Okay, and
So if I go to the State Board of Education,
it's
front page.
the Department of Education, it's gadoe.org is their website.
and then
And
go to
then-
their Simbly link?
Yeah, on theirs, there's tabs across the top, and one of them is the state board. And if you click on that, then you'll see in the left menu board agendas. There may be a much faster way to get to Simbly sites than this. That's the way I typically do it.
I'll check. I thought we'd had access to other board policies too in our system, but I'm not sure board docs.
I have
thought
not been able to find them.
I
So
don't,
too,
yeah, I
actually.
don't know if Board Docs does that or not. I know several of the districts do use Board Docs.
Boy, I mean, Linda, you're correct. When we got it, it was sold to us that way. And I've used it. Once in a while, I will stumble across another policy, but generally it picks up what's on the agenda. So if you, let's say fair dismissal, whenever I Google that, I find a lot of cases in Tennessee and a lot throughout the country, but they're typically agenda items. And so I really haven't found board docs that useful for my searches.
What Angela mentioned a few minutes ago, that could be a simpler way of doing it. Now, when I get ready to look at another school district, especially in Georgia, I just go directly to their website, www.
Yeah.
Whatever county it is, and k12.ga.us. And sometime it won't take you directly to the website, but it'll give you a number of areas there that you can click on.
Right, and that may not take you to their Simbly site where their policies are.
Yeah, I'm not seeing
Which is
that.
what she was asking about, is how to get to that.
Okay. Mhm.
And so you can say, well, and then we would love to have you back with Simbly and with your policies online and that if you choose to do that.
We're working on it as you speak. We're trying desperately to end the contract and not be double paying. So we're trying to work it out right now.
Oh, is that right? Okay, I hadn't heard that.
Okay,
Well,
good.
because we're trying to work out contract issues. So we're trying to resolve where we are to move to where we want to be.
Can we get a presentation on both of those before we make that decision?
We can.
Thank you.
Okay, just to finish up here, it's a little bit early, so if you have more questions, that's fine. But just a reminder here, the role of the board is the 30,000-foot view. And so that you can keep an eye on the whole district and you see everything in its entirety, the similarities, the differences, and the lower you come, the more closer you are to getting down into the weeds of things. And also just a reminder of the kind of checklist there of what people generally expect of a well-run district and board. And you'll also see that actually a lot of those things in there are things that Cognia looks for and comments on. And so I hope all of this has been helpful. It's been great discussion. I think we all learned things tonight. And if you have more questions, I will be glad to answer them or have Sam answer them.
Yes, I have a question, Angela, with Cognia. Years ago, SACS, Southern Associations for Colleges and Schools in the Southeast. And then, of course, you had division in the Midwest and so forth and so on. Now, is Cognia just one national division? You don't have divisions in the Southeast, Midwest, and other areas?
It's international, actually. Yes, they went from SACS to being called Advanced Ed. When they were Advanced Ed, they eliminated those other regional entities that were part of that group and all became Advanced Ed. And then they changed their name to Cognia, but they are worldwide.
Now, is there a regional office in Alpharetta?
I believe they do still have they have an office in Alpharetta, but most of the accreditation work is done out of their headquarters in Arizona.
Tempe, Arizona. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to follow up on the question I just asked you, which is how can I access model policies? Because I'm not finding those except for a few policies.
If you go into, just pick a district to open their site, and if you want to do an advanced search, so you would click on search and then advanced search if you're on Assembly site.
I'm in Assembly for Cartersville. Okay, so if I go up to search.
Okay, search, yeah. And then
policies.
You can search there, or if you want to search others besides Cartersville, click advanced search.
There we go.
And then you can put in, if you're looking for a particular policy, you can put in the code, or you can put in the term and search by the term, and then just click that you're checking the policies from that district and the other district.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bless you. I've been trying to do this for weeks.
Glad to help.
Thank you so much.
I've got a question for our board president. Lakeisha, should I just put on the parking lot the discussion on norms and policies, or norms and policies, or norms versus policies? Should I just save that for another discussion?
Well, I think if you think it's a question that can be addressed here, I did share, I think, with one person or two earlier that on our call yesterday with Dr. King and Dr. Rehm, we had a really good discussion regarding the norms, some feedback, as well as looking at how GSBA may even be able to support us, because there is we are doing a lot of work. So how do we bring all of that together? And so if you think it's relevant here, certainly ask it if it's related to policy. There will be some other conversations that occur around norms as we figure out a date and carve out some time to focus specifically.
Okay, I'm not trying to extend the meeting. I just wanted to make sure that there is a time further out to talk about it.
Yes, that time hasn't been determined yet, but we will be talking about norms, and as well as the idea of trying to make a little bit more progress with the norms, but also with the feedback that we've been given. But again, certainly feel free to ask. We just may not be able to have a complete conversation.
Well, it was just the relationship between norms and policy. It's just that relationship. That's it.
I'll let the experts answer, but from my understanding with norms and policy, your policy, our norms really are a little bit more specific in addressing like how we as board members go about our behavior. And so it fills in those gaps. It shouldn't conflict with policy. So to me, that's one of the distinguishing factors that it sort of puts, it puts into play what this should look like. So if there's like we have our code board of ethics and it says things like we should trust each other and we should, a variety of different things as it relates to communication with each other. And but the norms add more specifics around what that behavior actually looks like, because all 9 of us or all 10 of us may have different ideas of what it means, like what appropriate communication means, what it means to, address a problem. So that's my interpretation, but I am gonna maybe defer back to Dr. King and Ms. Palm to add some additional information.
Certainly, your norms and or your protocols those reflect the agreement that your governance team has entered into around about your behavior. Whether it relates to school norms for school visits. We use that as an example. Some boards, governance teams have decided they want to develop a norm and protocol for school visits. When do you notify superintendent? What a period of time? That kind of thing. Not and norms are not to interfere with policies. That's a separate piece, and it's for the board ensuring that it is functioning at a high level, and as well. And you will find that various boards decide to develop norms in different categories. It differs from one place to another, and it depends on the things that are of foremost importance for you right now. In terms of what you develop norms around. And sometimes it relates to how you address your public or how you address a complaint about staff members. What's the norm and expectation for communicating that back to the superintendent? And so it helped provide an ease for functioning for the board. And Angela, the policy piece I think is one we talked about yesterday, but when we talked to Dr. Gann on it. But I would love for you to share about some clarity around how that is not to be confused with policy, which is what we just talked about.
Yeah, as Sam said, it's the norms are very much specific and how you're going to conduct your business, as opposed to the things that we looked at with state board standards and in the code of ethics that has broader statements in them, but are not specific. The questions that came up as we walked through that about who do you ask, when do you go to this person, when do you do this, can I speak at this? All of those things are things that would be sorted out within the norms, as opposed to the broader things that are in your policy.
May I just make an analogy? As I listen to these discussions, it sounds like our norms are pretty much our regs for the board. Because that's what it's starting to sound like, and that's what they're starting to look like from the ones that I've reviewed. It's how we're going to implement that policy ourselves, and I think that's what it's starting to sound like.
In a way, I mean, the norms are the procedures that the board will follow in communicating with each other and conducting business.
Is that the typical response to boards developing this? I think it's important that we're doing it together as a board and we're all reviewing them and approving them. Is that typically how that happens, or is there another vehicle that we're missing here?
Many times boards do it a number of ways. Sometimes they're focusing on being proactive, with how they function. And sometimes it's reactive. We also find that boards have asked us to facilitate a conversation around them developing norms because they've had problems with some of these areas. You know, if it's an area around how you respond to complaints from your public, if they've had problems with how one board member interpreted that in terms of what his or her expectation might have been compared to another, then they said, you know, we need to come to the table to agree as a governance team on how we are going to function. Social media activity for board members. That's been a big one here recently with boards saying we want to talk about how we want to function as a governance team on social media and what our responsibility is. So that's separate from, you know, those other things. But just remember, this is a lens on governance team behavior and functioning as far as your routines. And I would caution you not to get bogged down in thinking that you need a norm and a protocol on everything, because that is not the intent. The intent is to ensure efficiency as far as how you function as a team.
Great. Where do we keep these?
Some boards have decided that they're going to, of course, enter into a review of these at least annually, but they post them on their site separate from policy, saying that here, these are our governance team's norms. And they post them there and make them available to their stakeholders, because then your stakeholders know how you're going to function. And sometimes it's, you all mentioned chain of command, you know, you probably have an unspoken or unwritten norm for that, or maybe it is documented. If it is, that's an example of your community and your public knowing how you're going to respond to those things. And sometimes it should also indicate accountability for you, because if your parents want to know, you know, how they can take a concern to the board and have it addressed, norms tell them that you've got a process to ensure that it will be addressed. It doesn't mean that you're going to go out there and solve it yourself, but they can clearly see that you have a process where it's reported to the appropriate party and it will be thoroughly reviewed, and then there's a response to it, those kinds of things.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Dr. King, I have a related question. So we're trying to work through our norm development now, and we've had some conversation, and I know you all had conversation. And so maybe Dr. Gant, is this something we're going to cover when we meet, but just about having those meetings hosted when you're working on norms? Have you all already spoken about that?
We have not settled on, we've got dates that are out there for you, but we've not attached the topics to it. But that's certainly, we've got a couple of dates out there that we can definitely.
But I didn't know if you all covered this in your time together yesterday, Dr. King, because what we're running into, I'm trying to see how other districts handle it. And I know Attorney Pruitt is on here with us. So what we run into is, because we have 2 or 3 board members working on developing norms, that we're treating those, and Attorney Pruitt, you can jump in, treating those as meetings. So now we're posting them, but which is fine with the posting. But then because we're in a virtual environment and open meetings, because of the number of board members together working on a norm, we're running into conflict with having to have those meetings live. So if Dr. Gann and Dr. Knox and I are working on our norms, and Ms. Davis and her team are working on her norms, and we're all meeting at 3 o'clock on Thursday, we can't go live with 2 or 3 groups working on norms simultaneously. And then we may have another group working on policy revisions with Dr. Yeager. So we're really struggling with how we are going to do that with broadcasting those meetings. Mike, did I capture that okay?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So do your other districts, how do they do that? Are they?
Very rarely do we see governance teams develop norms in small committees. Now, that doesn't mean it cannot be done.
Okay.
And the reason that that is rare, in my view, is that these norms are yours as a team. And it's very difficult when you decide that you're going to develop norms in a certain category, to do it if the full team isn't there to weigh in on what you're agreeing on. Because if a committee does that, then you've got to bring it back to the full board and have that full conversation. So you probably want to ask yourself, are you spinning wheels a little bit with time? So it is time consuming, however, even when the full team comes together to land on some agreement or consensus around whatever your norm is. But the intent is to get to agreement and consensus so that everybody understands that here's how we're going to function within these categories that have been problematic for us in the past. Or we want to ensure that they're never problematic for us. Because sometimes, you know, I remember sometimes it's about being proactive and sometimes it's a reactive piece. I think I see the reactive piece more so than I do the proactive piece when it comes to norms, because usually there's some bumps and bruises that the board has had within certain categories when they decide to develop norms for that. And that's fine to do that. I hope that clarified it a bit for you. You can continue to
That
do
helped.
it. Yeah, but you remember, so when that committee comes together, when you present it to the other board members, if they've not heard your conversation, you're going to have to go back and do that again. Because your governance team has to own these norms on how you're going to function.
Okay.
So you can figure out how you want to move forward with that if you continue to use a small committee.
So it may be useful for us to, as it relates to time, and the energy being spent, it could be beneficial for us to reconvene as a larger group. And I think I heard you say, based with our conversation yesterday, that is something that you all could also provide support around, much like in the way that when we did our very first norm, you know, we,
Sure.
developed like most of it. And I do, part of what you brought up, or the example was that, some boards are like, they knock it out, and then they're like, hey, review this. And then some boards are, may take a bit more time. So there's definitely something for me to consider. I was one of the ones thinking and maybe even suggesting that we use the team approach as a way to accomplish more, with different people working on it. But perhaps, that hasn't been the result.
Okay.
I have a couple of other questions that are not related to norms. So when done with the norms, can I ask those?
Kind of sounds like they're done with that.
Okay. I have two questions. One is very specific, which is how do we handle the annual review or annual signing of the code of ethics? You said something about a form that has the training and the ethics and the conflict of interest. Is that a single form that we can get from the district or from the GSBA?
Actually, the state produced it, and signing as far as the code of ethics. And then there is a training form that is completed, where everybody signs it that you did this training, and we have those forms.
Yeah, so it seems like what we haven't been doing, I think, is the code of ethics annual signature. And so we're trying to implement kind of how to get that into place. And I guess I was trying to find out if there's an official form or if we can just print it out and have people sign on the bottom and collect those pages, or.
Yeah, the Department of Education, remember when you went to the state board tab?
Okay.
And on the lower left, it'll say local school board governance, and all of their things related to the board governance, the code of ethics, everything is there.
Okay.
And so, and they've actually started posting the training forms that districts have sent in so that the public could look to see if they've met their training requirements or not.
Okay, great. My other question has to do with, it was on your slide 29, difficulties. How do you if someone is in violation of the code, how will it be handled? I think you said that there's no state law or no guidelines on that. It's up to us to make policy. Is that what I understood you to say?
Yeah, you don't have to necessarily make policy, but I think you do need to have some idea of what you would do if you were going to deal with that. The state board included in the model code of ethics. At the end of it, it says you can hold a hearing. It actually mimics the state language for the violation of conflict of interest. And if a majority of the members of the board felt that there was a violation, then you could find them in violation. And it is a hearing process. But the state board did not give any suggestions or include any kind of list. Usually what we've seen is that members of the board might censure another member for behavior. There's upsides, downsides to that. Some of the other things, I mean, there was one case in Cherokee where there was a monetary fine. And that board member actually challenged it, and it was upheld that the board could do that. When it comes to doing that, you have to think about what the impact is, and is it going to improve things or is it going to hurt things?
Exactly.
I've seen a couple of boards that wrote a letter, and there was no hearing or any of that. They just agreed that what the other person done was wrong. And so they wrote a letter telling the person that. And it was part of the public meeting whenever they presented the letter to the other board member. And so there again, it's finding the balance between self-policing and peer pressure to follow the code of ethics. Generally, the conflict of interest is not, I have not seen that be an issue since that passed, because it is financial interest, and that just doesn't come up with board members that I've seen anyway. The code of ethics is the one that tends to come up, but there again, if you're all holding each other responsible for following it, and that you're really consciously doing that, because it was part of the cognitive report, then that alone can help. And that may be the most positive thing that you can do, is just keep reminding each other that this is a policy and we have to follow the policy. And we have to say every year that we're following the policy. So I don't know that that really helped you with your question, but there's just not, it's just that the state just didn't want to go there and say, this is what you can or cannot do.
Can I ask Angela a question? I know I'm hijacking the board members meeting, but I have been asked numerous times also about that same question. Well, what are the range of consequences? And I always reply that Cherokee County State Board decision is the only authority I know of. And I've added to that, and even though the state board upheld a monetary fine, if that member refused to pay it, I have no idea how they legally enforce it. So
yeah, I don't know. I mean, luckily she gave in after that, so she had bigger legal problems after that. So
gotcha.
But it sounds like best practices is that we work it out among ourselves. Is that what I hear?
Yeah, but as I said, when you're looking at it, what's going to help the situation, which is what you want to do.
Yeah.
And what would hurt it. And sometimes just calling people out or holding a formal hearing and going through all things is just going to get somebody entrenched in whatever it was they did or whatever attitude they're carrying on that has created the issue. And so that's why I say you have to think about which way it's going to be better or not. But understanding that you do have the authority to hold a hearing and find somebody in violation and pick your poison, I guess.
I think it also is troubling because absence that accountability, then the behavior just continues or it escalates.
Yeah, and sometimes there's a case where something very publicly happened and the board, for the good of the district, needs to make a public statement that something was unacceptable. But they're gonna, it doesn't mean that you have to do the whole hearing and everything else. It can just be that you decide what you're gonna do. It's one of those, everybody wants to know how to make people behave and how to follow things. And sometimes there's just not a straight, simple answer. Anybody else?
There's a question,
Chat box.
yes, in the box. I'm not sure if you can see it.
I couldn't until I closed my.
I was gonna say, I can read it. It says, wasn't there a question about how to penalize speakers and whether this should be a norm? I'd be interested to know how other boards treat this. Oh, you mean as far as penalizing public speakers?
Correct.
I don't think you can penalize a public speaker. I'd say talk to your attorney about that one. I don't know what you would do to them.
Um,
Well, I think the discussion was not giving them the floor for several meetings or something like that. And I just remember thinking, is this permissible? Should this be a norm? And some discussion went around in a circle and then it was never brought up again. So,
Well, we actually decided to table that revision of the policy.
Yeah, it was a policy.
So yeah, that's correct, Dr. Anderson. So the board can, of course, the board doesn't have to allow public comment at all, other than on policies, as the presentation talked about. Most boards do, of course. And the rule is, as on any limited public forum, you cannot regulate the content of speech, but you can regulate time, place, and manner. So if someone exceeds the time limit, which is not a content neutral regulation, then of course the board doesn't have, monetary fine powers or anything like that. When we were thinking about it, when the policy committee was considering it, the one thing we could think of that you could do is to prohibit that person from speaking at the next meeting or some next series of meetings. Again, a time, place, and manner restriction.
I guess I was just wanting to know if this was standard with other boards around the state, or if there's a different way that other boards maybe handle this, because I think it was tabled so that there could be an exploration about whether or not this happens in other boards. So
I'm not familiar with anything. Yeah, I mean, it's a difficulty. I don't know of any board that has a magic answer for it. Of course, there's a Walker County case that went all the way to the 11th Circuit on a slightly different issue, but basically came out saying the same thing, that they had a procedure that the superintendent had to approve you to speak, and you had to tell him what you were going to talk about first. Of course, that's not content neutral, and the 11th Circuit struck that down. So.
Yeah, and by the way, one of the bills that passed this past session, it does not go into effect until July 2021. So you don't have to worry about it now, but just know it's there. It will require boards to allow public comments, and does not allow, and it's because of the Walker County thing, doesn't allow you to require them to follow rules ahead of time. It does allow the board chair still to limit time and the number of speakers. So as you're looking, it's the last part of Senate Bill 68. They just piled a whole bunch of stuff into that one. But as I said, it doesn't go into effect next year, but while you're looking at it, just keep in mind that will be there.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for this information. It's extremely helpful. We are just in the process of reading a lot and trying to really correct the areas that we know need correcting. and that's the process. So I do thank you all for your sharing your expertise. If there are no more questions at this time, we'll move forward in our agenda and open the floor for a motion to adjourn.
Linda, go for it.
So moved.
Okay.
So I'm
Dr.
busy
Yates.
trying to say goodbye to everybody. I so moved.
Okay, Dr. Yeager made her motion first, and then
That's fine.
seconded by Ms. Davis. I don't see any objections on our screen, so all in favor of adjourning at 8:38, if you would show by raising your hands and saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, I don't see any opposed. We are adjourned at 8:39.
Stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.